She had once walked those halls in triumph, every eye fixed on her, every noble bowing, every tapestry newly woven for her arrival. 3 years earlier, the same stones had echoed with cheers as Anne Boleyn, dressed in cloth of gold and crowned with Tudor glory, entered the Tower of London, not as a prisoner but as a queen ascending to power. Now, on the 2nd day of May, in the year 1536, she returned by barge under a grey sky, her hands trembling, her heart pounding against ribs that suddenly felt like a cage. The banners were gone, the musicians silenced. The path that had once been strewn with flowers was now lined with soldiers, and waiting inside those cold, ancient walls was the death she had not yet fully accepted. Her name would be torn from the court records, her marriage declared a lie, her daughter declared a bastard, and behind it all stood the man she had once loved, so deeply she thought him capable of changing heaven and earth, Henry VIII. What Anne did not yet know, as she stepped onto the wet stone steps that day, was that her fate had been decided long before any accusation reached her ears. The King of England, no longer the golden prince of his youth, but a limping, brooding man with a festering leg and a crumbling ego, had already given the order. His minister, Thomas Cromwell, had orchestrated the details with terrifying precision. Spies had been planted. Confessions had been extracted, some under torture, others under threats, so chilling they did not require physical pain. Witnesses were ready, charges drawn up. A court would be assembled not to find truth, but to perform judgment. The machinery had been built, and all that remained was to push her into its gears. Her death would not be the result of a single crime or moment of weakness. It would be the conclusion of a strategy, months in the making, and the true reason behind it would never be whispered aloud in court, that the king had simply grown tired of her. The fall of Anne Boleyn did not begin with adultery or treason. It began with a miscarriage. On the 29th day of January, the same day Catherine of Aragon was buried, Anne lost a child that many believed to be a son. That child had not yet been born 3 full months. The court whispered. Some blamed stress. Others pointed to the king's recent jousting accident, which had left him unconscious for hours and limping ever since. Anne, already deeply unsettled by Henry's open flirtation with Jane Seymour, one of her own ladies, was overwhelmed with grief. That was the moment her enemies chose to strike. A queen who could not deliver a son was no longer a miracle but a liability. A queen whose husband's affection wandered was suddenly vulnerable. And when that queen had made as many enemies as Anne had, both in court and in church, the danger was not abstract. It was imminent. By the time the May Day joust arrived, Anne was already under surveillance. Every smile she gave, every word spoken to a courtier, every glance exchanged with a musician, was recorded and twisted into evidence. That day, the 1st of May, should have been a celebration of spring, of chivalry and renewal. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most chilling betrayals in royal history. Henry and Anne sat together in the royal stands, watching knights thunder toward each other in glittering armor. Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's oldest and most trusted friends, competed in the tournament. Mark Smeaton, a young musician in Anne's service, played his lute nearby. All seemed calm, until a messenger arrived with a folded note. Henry read it. His face changed. Without a word to Anne, without so much as a look, the king stood and left, taking Norris with him. Anne remained seated, surrounded by silence, the eyes of the court fixed on her. Her husband's abandonment in that moment was not just personal, it was political, and it was final. Within hours, arrests began. Mark Smeaton was taken first, then Norris, then others. Interrogations began. Confessions were extracted. Anne, still unaware of what was coming, who played tennis the next morning, laughed with her ladies, wore her finest French gown. Then came the summons. She was told the king's privy council required her presence. That alone should have sent a chill through her bones. Queens were not summoned like servants. She obeyed. Of course. And when she entered the room and saw her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, standing beside two grim-faced men, she must have known her world was ending. The charges were read: adultery, conspiracy to murder the king, incest. Her brother's name was on the list. The man she had danced with, studied with, grown up beside, George Boleyn. She was accused of kissing him with her tongue, of mocking the king's performance in bed, of promising to marry another man once Henry was dead, and though she cried out in disbelief, demanded to speak to the king, insisted on her innocence. It did not matter. The trap had already closed. Her pleas would never reach the ears of the man who had once broken with Rome to marry her. What makes Anne Boleyn's story not only tragic but terrifying is not the swiftness of her fall or the absurdity of her charges. It is the chilling deliberation with which the entire spectacle was arranged. The king ensured she would be beheaded, not with a crude axe, but with a French sword, a final nod to her style. Perhaps, or simply a way to make the whole thing seem cleaner. He arranged for her execution down to the location and the hour, then annulled their marriage the day before she died, so that their daughter would be declared a bastard and their union erased. Henry wanted not only to remove Anne, but to scrub her from history, yet he failed. For her daughter, Elizabeth, would rise against all odds to become the greatest monarch England had ever seen. And Anne, far from being forgotten, would become the most famous queen to ever wear the English crown. What happened behind the closed doors of Greenwich Palace? What whispered from the damp stone walls of the Tower? What echoed through the creak of ropes and the hush of silken skirts on scaffold steps? Was not just the end of one woman. It was a revelation of power at its most dangerous. Love twisted into punishment. Justice warped by politics, and a king who did not hesitate to turn his bed into a battlefield, and his wife into a warning. Behind closed doors, Henry VIII did not simply betray his queen. He orchestrated her execution with ink, wax, steel, and silence. It began, as so many tragedies do, not with a scream, not with a sword, but with a silence that fell over Greenwich Palace on the 29th day of January in the year 1536. The kind of silence that creeps in after a long night of waiting, the kind that settles over tiled floors and thick curtains, and the breath of courtiers too afraid to speak. Outside, the snow had turned the gardens white, pressing its hush upon the hedges and trees. Inside, 2 rooms bore witness to 2 moments that would change the course of England forever. In one, far away in Peterborough Abbey, the body of Catherine, of Aragon, Henry's first queen, discarded but not forgotten, was lowered into the cold stone of her tomb. And in the other, behind the carved doors of Anne Boleyn's chamber, blood soaked the linen sheets and stained the silence. Crimson. The queen had lost her child. They said it was a boy. The child had been growing inside her for nearly 3 months. And those closest to the court whispered that the shape of her belly and the glint in Henry's eyes meant the long-awaited heir had finally come. But by morning, it was gone. Her ladies did not say much. They brought warm cloth and warm hands. held her fingers when her body trembled, replaced the basin without a word. Some cried quietly in the corners of the chamber. Others only stared. Anne herself said little. She clutched her stomach, as if she could will the child back into being, as if sheer force of longing could stitch time back together. But time is a cruel thing when it is unraveling. And this time, it came undone in blood and grief and the scent of something lost forever. They would later say that the miscarriage was caused by shock, that Anne, having heard of the king's accident, a violent fall during a jousting match that had left Henry unconscious and broken beneath his armor, had collapsed in terror, that she had begged to see him, pleaded to be brought to his bedside, and had been refused, that she had discovered, almost in the same breath, that her husband had been exchanging letters, glances, maybe even promises, with one of her own ladies, a pale girl named Jane Seymour, whose silence and lowered gaze concealed a mind trained for ambition. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. The son was gone, and with him, so too went the last fragile thread binding Anne to Henry's favor. The king was 44 years old that winter. Gone was the golden prince of 20 years earlier, the champion in tournaments, the musician who played the lute with tenderness and ease. Now, he limped through the halls, his injured leg swelling and weeping behind the velvet and leather of his boots. The wound from his jousting fall never fully healed. It turned his walk into a shuffle, and his mood into thunderclouds. He raged more often, listened less frequently, and in his rare smiles, there was always the shadow of calculation. His courtiers learned to watch his face before they dared speak. He had become dangerous. And Anne, once the sun around which he orbited, was beginning to cast a shadow of her own. Jane Seymour was not like Anne, where Anne had been dark-haired, sharp-tongued, and French in her fashion. Jane was fair, quiet, and wrapped herself in English modesty like a cloak. Where Anne had sparred with Henry in words, in will, in wit, Jane bent like a reed. Always respectful, always just out of reach. She had learned from Anne's rise. And more importantly, she had learned from Anne's mistakes. She would not become the king's mistress. She would not fall before the crown touched her brow. She would be a wife, or nothing. And in that restraint, she became irresistible. The Seymours were no fools. They saw in Jane a ladder, and they encouraged her ascent with carefully orchestrated humility. Anne knew. She saw it in the glances, the gestures, the sudden absences in her husband's schedule. She had played this game before, à vicid or leer, when it was Catherine of Aragon who watched her husband turn away. But this time, the fear was hers. And unlike Catherine, Anne had no powerful emperor for a nephew. No crowd of Englishmen who saw her as their rightful queen. What she had was a body that had failed to produce a living son, and a court that had never fully embraced her. By March of that year, the walls were beginning to shift. Cromwell, the king's chief minister, brilliant and brutal, had noticed the queen's diminishing favor. They had once been allies. Both had championed reform. But now, Anne's opinions grated on him. She opposed his policies. She scorned his plans to dissolve the monasteries. She whispered warnings into the king's ear that he did not like. For a man like Cromwell, opposition was not just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. And so, as Henry's heart wandered toward Jane, Cromwell's mind began to sharpen its blades. It would take more than mere infidelity to remove Anne. Henry had risked civil war to marry her. He had broken with Rome, and split the country in half, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. All for the promise of a son through Anne's body. To divorce her now would not only make him look foolish, it would raise terrible questions about Elizabeth's legitimacy, about his own judgment. No. If Anne was to be erased, it had to be through treason, through a crime so unforgivable, so monstrous, that no one would dare mourn her. That was the path Cromwell prepared. He began by placing women in Anne's household eyes and ears who would note every word, every glance, every smile. He revived an old friendship with a court musician, Mark Smeaton, whose position gave him access to the Queen's private chambers. He opened his ledgers and found men who had been close to Anne: Sir Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and even George Boleyn, her own brother. Then, with a coldness that history still trembles to remember, he laid the trap. And Anne, brilliant as she was, and never saw it coming. In April, 2 commissions were quietly established to investigate treason in the counties where Anne resided. No crime had yet been named. No evidence had yet been gathered. But the court was being built, the witnesses were being chosen, the doors to justice were closing, one creaking hinge at a time. And still, in those days before the thunder broke, Anne went about her duties. She attended Mass. She dined in public. She walked the long corridors of Greenwich Palace in gowns laced with pearls and gold. She laughed with her ladies, sat beside Henry in court, kissed her daughter on the forehead at bedtime. Perhaps she sensed it, the shift in the wind, the looks from servants that lasted too long, the silence of old friends. But she had been queen for 3 years. She had faced down the Pope. She had been crowned with St. Edward's crown, reserved only for monarchs. Surely she could face this too. But no one had told her yet the miscarriage had not just taken her son, it had taken her future. Her enemies had counted the days. Her husband had counted the risks. And now, Cromwell was counting the steps to her ruin. And so it was that the woman who had once risen higher than any queen before her began her fall not with a sword, but with a broken heart, a broken body, and a king who no longer saw her as the mother of his heir, but as a mistake that needed to be erased. There are moments in history when whispers become knives, when innocent gestures turn into weapons, and when a queen's laugh, a brother's embrace, or a servant's loyalty can be twisted into the shape of a noose. That is what happened in the days following Anne Boleyn's miscarriage. What began with a single loss of life in the womb soon became a cascade of accusations, a labyrinth of betrayal, and a cruel symphony composed by men who knew exactly what chords to strike. It was in these days between the final frost of April and the fading light of May that the trap Thomas Cromwell had set began to close with the slow, merciless precision of a funeral bell. And the first man to fall was the youngest, the softest, the one who sang for her, a musician named Mark Smeaton. He was not born of noble blood. He did not dine in the halls of the mighty, or sign his name with the curl of landed pride. Mark was the son of a craftsman, a gifted lute player, and a singer whose voice had once been praised in the royal chapel. Through talent and discipline alone, he had risen to a place of fragile favor, brought into the Queen's household, not as a courtier, not as a suitor, but as something else entirely, a servant of sound. A boy who turned air into music. Anne liked music. She liked brilliance, subtlety, and wit. Mark was young and charming, and he made her laugh. He may have handed her gloves once. He may have bowed a little too long. Perhaps, in a moment of innocent joy, He had played something that made her eyes fill with tears. But in the new climate of suspicion, none of that mattered. On the 30th day of April, in the year 1536, Mark was summoned by Thomas Cromwell. No warrant. No explanation. He was brought to Cromwell's residence in Stepney, not to court, not to the king, but to a private house where the walls heard no protest and the doors kept in the screams. What was done to him, there remains a matter of debate, even centuries later. Some believe he was tortured, perhaps with ropes bound around the temples until the pressure drove reason away. Others suggest he was promised mercy, told that if he confessed, he might be spared. Whatever the truth, by the end of that night, Mark Smeaton had signed a confession, claiming that he had been the Queen's lover. Not once, not in a moment of drunken folly, but repeatedly. That was the first brick. And once the wall began to rise, others were forced in with bloodied hands. The next to be accused was Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry VIII's oldest and most trusted friends. His position was intimate, groom of the stool, a role that placed him at the king's side in the most private of hours. He knew Henry's thoughts, moods, even his pains, and he had also, it seemed, once spent too long in the Queen's presence. A conversation had been overheard, a moment in which Anne had teased him, perhaps flirted, perhaps said something too clever for a woman to say without being misunderstood. The kind of jest that had once delighted Henry now became damning. Norris was arrested without warning and brought to the Tower of London. His loyalty shattered beneath the weight of an accusation that could not be disproved. Then came Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton Young, well-born, and guilty only of having spoken with the Queen when others were watching. Their names were added to the list, their fates sealed. But it was the final accusation that tore through court like a storm splitting the sky. Anne Boleyn had been charged with committing incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. George had been more than a brother to Anne. He had been her confidant, her mirror, her fellow mind in a world that had little patience for intellect in women. They had grown up together in Hever Castle, shared the air of the French court, written poems, spoken Latin, argued theology. His wit was as sharp as hers, his ambition as high. He had served in Parliament, held titles, and been admired and feared for the speed of his tongue. That closeness, which had once been admired as a sign of familial strength, was now reinterpreted as something far darker. The charge was not merely adultery. It was incest. It was treason. It was the murder of all things holy. The indictment alleged that Anne had kissed her brother in ways no sister should, that she had laughed at the king's performance in bed with her lovers, that she had spoken aloud the unthinkable that she would marry Henry Norris after the king's death. To say such a thing was to imagine the king's death, and to imagine his death was treason, punishable by fire or sword. But these were not charges built upon evidence. There were no letters, no witnesses of the acts themselves, only the twisted recollections of frightened ladies, the testimony of men pressed to the edge of reason, and the careful orchestration of Cromwell's legal machinery. Anne, still cloistered within her apartments. I heard the names one by one. She had seen Norris ride with the king only days before. She had spoken to Smeaton about a mask. She had embraced her brother before dinner, in view of 20 others. None of it had seemed dangerous then, but now, each smile was a noose, each memory a blade. She asked again and again to speak to Henry. She begged to be brought before him, but there was no answer. The king had stopped listening. The question of guilt had never been the point. The purpose was removal. Swift, total, and irrevocable. The court could not risk another queen's influence. Henry could not risk another failed son. Cromwell could not risk another voice opposing his reforms. So, the truth was shaped to fit the sentence. A woman's intelligence became arrogance. Her charm became seduction. Her confidence, treason. And all the men who had stood too close, who had dared to speak, or serve, or smile, they were swept up into the same current and dragged to the Tower. Meanwhile, Anne remained in the Queen's apartments. She could not sleep. She prayed through the night, her hands clenched in white-knuckled desperation. She paced between the windows. She wept, then stopped herself. Her ladies, replaced with spies, watched her every move, noted every tear. She knew she was not safe. But even then, she may not have understood the depth of what had already been written. This was not a matter to be argued. It was a stage to be performed, and the script had been drafted in silence. When the guards finally came for her, the tide on the Thames had turned. They brought her to a barge, the same way she had once come as a crowned queen. She passed under the archway of the Tower and said aloud the words that history has never forgotten, "Shall I die without justice?" To that, Sir William Kingston could only reply, with what little comfort he had, that even the poorest of the king's subjects received justice. And Anne, already knowing the truth, answered with a hollow smile, "Then I am the queen no more." The flute player, the groom of the stool, the brother, none of them were guilty of anything but proximity. None of them had laid a hand upon her in secret, but they would each pay with their lives for stepping too near the throne and for loving, or merely serving, a woman whom the king had decided to unlove. It was not a courtroom. Not truly. It was a theater of silence. A cathedral of predetermined echoes, where the outcome had been decided before a word was spoken, and every chair had already chosen its verdict before its occupant sat. On the 15th day of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, accused of adultery, incest, and treason, was led through the gates of the Tower of London not to be judged, but to be condemned. The King's Hall had been arranged for spectacle. The floor was swept and polished. The tapestries hung higher than usual, rich with scenes of knightly honor and pious virtue, cruel backdrops for what was about to unfold. 2,000 eyes were there to witness her fall. Nobles in feathered hats, ladies in heavy silks, guards in black with halberds at their sides. All had come not for justice, but for confirmation that the king, in his wisdom, had been wronged by the woman he had once exalted. That Anne, crowned in gold, draped in violet, and sharp with learning, had indeed deserved the sword. She was brought in wearing black, the color of mourning, and for the first time in years, it suited her. Her eyes dark, once defiant, were heavy now, with something deeper than fear. There was exhaustion in her face, but not surrender. She walked slowly, her chin raised just enough that the crowd could not call her broken. She took her seat in the chair placed at the center of the hall, elevated so that all could see her clearly, as though she were not a woman on trial, but a relic to be displayed. Around her, 27 men gathered in judgment. Among them, her own uncle Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who had once celebrated her coronation, and now would speak the words that would end her life. He sat still, his expression unreadable, his robe weighty with power. No man who held kinship with the accused showed it. That day, blood meant nothing. Only allegiance to the king mattered. The charges were read with ceremony, their words thick and deliberate. Anne was accused of betraying her marriage with 5 men: Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and her own brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The court was told that she had committed adultery in various royal residences, on various dates, some of which had been deliberately chosen to place the accused near her regardless of truth, that she had conspired against the king's life, imagining his death, and planning her rise with her supposed lovers, that she had kissed George with indecency, spoken words of lust, and mocked the king's body, that she had used her beauty to manipulate, seduce, and betray. But no physical evidence was produced. No letters, no drawings, no witnesses to the acts themselves, only Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under circumstances too dark to name, and the reports from her ladies' women who had once braided her hair and now were made to repeat moments, glances, jokes, as though they had been signs of treason all along. Anne sat motionless as they accused her. Only when she rose to speak did the air in the hall shift, as if those ancient stones, too, were listening. Her voice was clear, measured, and despite the weight of the charges, she answered each one with calm defiance. She denied every accusation. She named the days when she was with child and could not have committed the crimes. She pointed out that some of the men named had not even been at court on the dates cited. Her logic was precise, and her courage astonishing. Yet everyone in the room knew that logic had no place there. Her answers, however brave, would not change the tide. The hall had already decided. The performance had simply required her presence to feel complete. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, they did not retire. There was no candlelit room, no whispered debate, no trembling hands weighing evidence. Instead, each of the 27 men rose in turn and declared her guilty, one after another. Like dominoes falling in deliberate rhythm, not one voice dissented, not one hesitation marred the procession, and when all had spoken, the Duke of Norfolk stood last. It was he who bore the duty of pronouncing the sentence to be burned at the stake or beheaded at the king's mercy. His voice, it was said, trembled. Some claimed tears ran down his cheeks. Whether from grief or performance, no one could say. But when the final words were spoken, Anne bowed her head slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. She had been sentenced to die, but she had not been erased. Not yet. Her reaction surprised many. She did not weep. She did not beg. Instead, she said she was ready to die, but that she sorrowed deeply for the men who would die because of her, that they were innocent, that she would gladly suffer 1,000 deaths if it meant saving them. Her voice broke when she spoke of her brother, of George, her equal in mind, her twin in spirit, her last true ally. The silence that followed her words was not respectful. It was terrified, because what she said had the clarity of truth. And truth, in that room, was the most dangerous thing of all. The next 2 days passed slowly. Anne was returned to her apartments, where guards paced outside her doors and spies listened through the walls. She prayed. She wrote. She prepared herself, but she could not prepare for the sound she would hear on the morning of the 17th day of May, the thunder of cannon fire from the tower's gun platforms, the iron echo of 5 blasts that told the world the men had died. Smeaton, Norris, Weston, Brereton, Rochford, her brother, her friend, her ghost, all executed that morning on Tower Hill. their bodies buried in silence, their names cursed or pitied by those who had once bowed before them. Anne heard the cannon. She knew exactly what they meant. She said nothing. The men had died in order. George was first granted the mercy of death before watching his friends fall. The others followed quickly. None confessed. Most spoke cryptically, praising the king, asking for prayers. Smeaton alone offered words that hinted at guilt. But even that could have been fear speaking, not truth. The scaffold was soaked in old blood and new. The crowd watched in stillness. No cheers. No jeers. Only the awful weight of royal justice doing its work. They had died not because they had sinned, but because they had been chosen to be proof of Anne's guilt, chosen to justify the crown's cruelty. Anne remained alive for 2 more nights. During those hours, her marriage was annulled. Her name was erased from the Queen's records. Elizabeth, her daughter, was declared a bastard. The child she had suffered to bring into the world now had no claim to the throne. The king made no visit, no letter, no farewell, just silence. And beneath that silence, the sound of England shifting, one heartbeat at a time. The trial of Anne Boleyn was never about truth. It was about necessity. It was about reputation, control, fear. It was about removing a woman who had risen too far, spoken too boldly, and loved too dangerously. It was a play in which every actor knew their lines, and at the center of it stood Anne, not a villain, not a seductress, not a traitor, but a woman. Brilliant, flawed, human, and soon to be dead. She had always known how to hold her composure in a room full of enemies. It was a skill Anne Boleyn had cultivated long before she ever wore a crown. Honed in the salons of the French court, where every glance was weighed and every word sharpened like a blade. But in the final days of her life, within the walls of the tower that had once greeted her with trumpets and garlands, Anne found herself watched not by courtiers but by guards. Not flattered but recorded. Her every sigh passed along to Cromwell's men, like relics of a relic already fading. The doors to her chamber had been shut not for privacy, but containment. Her ladies-in-waiting once chosen by her, once whisperers of confidences and keepers of secrets, had been replaced with women loyal not to her, but to the state. They were instructed not to comfort, but to observe, to transcribe her grief like stenographers at a funeral without a priest. Anne was still alive, but every moment of her existence had already been written as if she were dead. And yet, she did not collapse into despair. Not entirely. There were moments they recorded when she laughed. The kind of laugh that startles the listener, that dances along the edge between madness and clarity. A laugh that knew too much. She spoke of death as if it were a promotion. She mused aloud that the king had lifted her from a simple maid to marchioness, from marchioness to queen, and now would raise her even further to martyrdom. There was a strange dignity in it. And those who witnessed her in those days admitted that her composure unnerved them more than tears would have. Anne Boleyn was not the trembling ghost they had expected. She was still, somehow, herself clever, defiant, and vivid. The execution had been scheduled for the 18th day of May. Her confession had never come. There was no plea for mercy, no letter of remorse, but something, perhaps the weather, perhaps the timing of courtly ceremonies, caused a delay. She rose that morning expecting death. She dressed with care. She prayed. She prepared. And then, nothing. They came to her in the early light and told her it would not be today. Her composure cracked for a moment then, not out of fear, but of exhaustion. A body can only brace for death for so long before it begins to fray. But Henry, meticulous even in cruelty, had other plans. He had arranged for a special executioner, a swordsman brought from Calais, renowned for his precision, his speed, and his silence. It was considered a mercy, a clean death, swifter and more noble than the English axe. But that mercy only sharpened the irony. The man who had destroyed her reputation, stripped her of her title, and erased her marriage, had still arranged for her death to be elegant. That, perhaps, he was Henry's final message, that he could destroy her thoroughly, yet beautifully, that he alone decided the terms of her ending. On the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, the sun rose over London with an indifferent softness. The cobblestones were dry, the crows were silent, and on Tower Green, just within the fortress walls, a scaffold had been erected lower and smaller than the ones used for traitors on Tower Hill. This was to be a private death. No mobs, no years, just a few chosen witnesses. Her ladies helped her dress in a gown of gray or black, the sources differ, trimmed with ermine. And over it she wore a red kirtle, the color of martyrdom. Her dark hair had been bound and tucked under a linen coif, so that the sword would find no resistance. She wore no jewels, no crown, nothing that marked her as queen, save her bearing. She walked to the scaffold, with her eyes steady. Those who stood along her path reported the strange quiet of her footsteps. Not hurried, not hesitant, only even. There were moments when she looked up at the sky, as if measuring the light. Perhaps she was searching for something beyond the clouds. Perhaps she was reminding herself that the world was still there, still turning, that even this would pass. The crowd was solemn. Among them stood the Duke of Suffolk, the Lord Chancellor, and other high-ranking men of court. Notably absent was the king. Henry had chosen to spend the day at a nearby palace, feasting. Dressed in white, he had already begun planning his next wedding to Jane Seymour. The ink had barely dried on Anne's annulment. The royal tailor had been summoned. The jewels had been removed from the Queen's treasury and delivered to Jane's household. But Anne knew this. She had known it for days. When she stepped onto the platform, she turned not to the crowd, but to the priest. She knelt for a final prayer. Then she rose and addressed the witnesses, not with bitterness, not with accusations, but with obedience. She declared herself guilty of no wrong toward the king, acknowledged his greatness, and asked those present to pray for her soul. She praised him as a kind and merciful Lord. And though those words have been dissected for centuries, and most agree they were not lies, but armor, to speak ill of the king, even in death, I could still bring ruin to one's family. And Anne had a daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years old, waiting somewhere far from this scaffold, too young to understand that history was about to make her mother disappear. She knelt once more, this time not for prayer, but for death. A blindfold was tied around her eyes. She adjusted it herself, so that it lay smooth. The executioner, trained in the French style, did not use a block. Instead, Anne would kneel upright, her neck extended, her hands folded in front of her. The sword was hidden from view. The swordsman had asked for it to be so. He had also brought a small chest of fine sand to catch the blood, so it would not splatter the platform. He stepped forward softly, whispering instructions to his assistant. Then, he called aloud for someone to hand him the sword, a trick, to distract her, to make her turn her head slightly. She did, And in that moment, he struck. The blade cut cleanly, so cleanly that some said her lips were still moving after her head struck the straw, that her eyes remained open for several seconds, blinking as if confused. But no one could be certain. The body crumpled beside the block. Her ladies, weeping but silent, stepped forward with a cloth and a basket. They gathered her head and her body, wrapped them, and carried them to a small chapel nearby, St. Peter ad Vincula, where she would be buried in an unmarked grave beneath the floor. No monument, no name, only silence. The cannons fired. The crown passed. The king remarried within 11 days. But Anne did not vanish. Not truly. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would survive the chaos of court, outlast the men who condemned her mother, and rise to become one of the most powerful monarchs England had ever known. And though Anne's name had been dragged through dirt, her memory rose from the ground with every breath Elizabeth took. The sword from Calais had done its work. The Queen was dead, but her shadow remained long, sharp, and impossible to erase. In the court of Henry VIII, truth bent like iron in a forge, and no man knew how to shape it better than Thomas Cromwell. He was not born with a title. He did not ride in childhood beside a heralded father or dine beneath cathedral ceilings. He was the son of a blacksmith, born in the low streets of Putney, baptized beneath the smoke of working chimneys, and trained not in courtly manners, but in the hard arithmetic of survival. His mind was not shaped by Latin verse or chivalric tales, but by the blunt tools of trade, law, and diplomacy. And yet, when Anne Boleyn died beneath a French sword on the green grass of the Tower, it was Cromwell's hand that had drawn the pattern of her fall. As meticulously as any architect carving a cathedral ceiling, he was no nobleman, but he had become the king's most trusted servant, and for a time, perhaps even his equal in power. In the days after Anne's death, the court moved with shocking speed. Henry, with his usual disdain for mourning, married Jane Seymour just 11 days later in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall. There were no banners, no tournement, no songs, only the efficient click of court machinery shifting into its next phase. The Queen was gone, and her name was no longer to be spoken. Her portraits were removed, her initials scratched from stonework, her servants reassigned. Elizabeth, now a bastard in the eyes of the law, was taken from her household and relocated under careful watch. The king had wiped the slate clean, but one name remained, written not in scandal, but in ink. Cromwell. He had survived where others had fallen. Wolsey had perished in disgrace. More had died for conscience. But Cromwell thrived. He had arranged the downfall of Anne with the skill of a chess master, sacrificing a queen to win the board. Every step had been calculated: the commission, the arrests, the testimony, the trial. And now that it was done, he stood not as a villain, but as the man who had rid the king of a mistake. The courtiers bowed to him. The ambassadors wrote of him. The king trusted him. But Cromwell, for all his rising fortune, did not mistake power for permanence. He had watched too many heads roll to believe himself untouchable. There is something almost spectral in how he moves through the records of those years. Never the loudest, never the most flamboyant, but always there behind the parchment, behind the orders, behind the changing tides of favor. He reshaped England's relationship with Rome, orchestrated the dissolution of the monasteries, and rewrote the very language of royal supremacy. But it was in the silence after Anne's death that his influence hardened into something more permanent. The king needed men who could make things disappear: queens, rebellions, inconvenient truths, and Cromwell had proven he could. He had not simply destroyed Anne. He had constructed the idea that her destruction was just. That was his genius. He understood that a lie needed architecture. It needed documentation, witness, performance. And so the court remembered not Anne's brilliance, but her betrayal. Not her child Elizabeth, but her laughter at the king's expense. Cromwell had taken the stories whispered in corners and bound them into law. He had made guilt official, and the people, weary and reverent. I believed it. But the paradox of Thomas Cromwell was that he had once supported Anne. He had helped broker the marriage, pushed forward the break with Rome, and defended her legitimacy when others doubted. What had changed? Historians would ask that question for centuries. Some say it was policy, that Anne had opposed his economic reforms, especially the seizure of church lands. Others say it was survival, that he sensed the king's heart had shifted and knew he would fall unless he followed. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps Cromwell had no loyalty, but to England itself, not the land, but the machinery of the state, the power that must continue regardless of who wore the crown. And yet, beneath the records, a trace of guilt lingers. He once remarked, in later years, that he had wept when she died. Whether the words were sincere or political, no one can say, but they linger, like dust upon old vellum. Perhaps he mourned not Anne, but the necessity of what he had done. For Cromwell, death was a tool, not a judgment, and Anne's death had been necessary not for justice, but for momentum. In the years that followed, Cromwell's star continued to rise. He became Lord Great Chamberlain, then Baron of Oakham, and eventually Earl of Essex. He arranged the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a diplomatic match meant to secure Protestant alliances, though it would prove his undoing. But in the summer after Anne Boleyn's death, he was untouchable. He moved through the corridors of power with quiet authority, gathering wealth, granting favors, extending influence. The son of a blacksmith now walked as the architect of empires. And yet, the tower never forgets. Its stones remember every step. And within those walls, Cromwell had written his name in shadow. He had not spilled the blood himself, but he had drawn the maps that led others to do so. He had convinced a king to believe what needed to be believed, that Anne had betrayed him, that her lovers had conspired, that a daughter could be erased. And once the king believed, Cromwell ensured that no voice could ever say otherwise. The lesson of Thomas Cromwell is not that the lowborn cannot rise. It is that they rise differently. Through cleverness, through silence, through loyalty that cuts deeper than love. He was not like the nobles who fell for vanity or passion. He was a man who measured every step. And yet, like Anne, he too would eventually stand in the tower, betrayed by the very king he had served. But that would come later. For now, he reigned not with a crown, but with a pen. The world moved on. Jane Seymour gave Henry the son he had craved. Cromwell's vision of a leaner, reformed England grew bolder. And somewhere, beneath the stone floors of St. Peter ad Vincula, the bones of Anne Boleyn lay nameless, her story already being rewritten by those who had survived her. And in every revised version, Thomas Cromwell's fingerprints were faint but firm, the mark of a man who understood not just how history is made, but how it is remembered. There are letters that never reach their destination, letters folded with trembling hands, sealed with wax that cools too slowly, ink still wet when the sound of footsteps echoes beyond the door. Some are torn before they're read. Others hidden away in drawers for centuries. Their truths locked beneath silence and dust. But the one they speak of, the one believed to have been written by Anne Boleyn in the final hours before her execution, was a letter forged not merely of ink and parchment, but of the last fragile threads of hope, longing, and betrayal. They say she wrote it alone in her chamber at the Tower, her hands pale with prayer, her eyes burning not with rage, but with something deeper, the impossible desire to be understood by the man who had once sworn he would move heaven and earth for her, and who now sent a French swordsman to sever her head with elegant efficiency. It was addressed simply, "To the king." No greeting, no flourish, no plea disguised as poetry. The words, though disputed by historians, have lived on in whispers. She began by acknowledging that she did not expect her words to change what had been decided, that she had resigned herself to death, and yet could not silence the truth within her. She reminded him of their love, of the vows exchanged, the battles fought, the kingdom nearly broken for the sake of her crown. She asked him not for her life, but for fairness, for memory. She denied the charges again, not in a scream, not in desperation, but with the calm that settles over a person who knows they have nothing left to lose. She wrote of Elizabeth, their daughter, their blood. She asked that the child be treated kindly, that she not be punished for her mother's fall. And then, with the steadiness of a woman who had been stripped of everything but dignity, she ended the letter. No signature was necessary. He knew the hand that wrote it. Whether Henry read it is unknown. If he did, he left no reply. There was no summons, no final audience, only silence. The Tower had eyes too many, and none of them blinked. The women assigned to watch Anne in her last days were not friends. They were spies. They reported every word she spoke, every sigh, every moment of weeping or strange calm. When she prayed, they noted the length of her silence. When she laughed, they recorded it as madness. When she spoke of Henry, they listened for cracks in her voice, ready to report defiance as treason. She was never alone, not even in the small hours of the night. The room where she slept or tried to was the same one where she had once rested in anticipation of her coronation. The carvings on the wood-paneled walls, once a symbol of joy, now closed in like the frame of a tomb. The days in the Tower were not loud. They passed in quiet cruelty, the kind that eats at the soul without leaving bruises. Meals were brought and left untouched. Prayers repeated until the words lost meaning. Footsteps passed the door like the ticking of a clock that would never stop. Anne alternated between composure and collapse. She spoke of Elizabeth often, asked for news, wrote notes that were never sent, spoke to the walls as if they might remember her kindly. There were moments when she seemed to believe that Henry might call her back, that he might relent, that mercy might find its way between the stones of the Tower and the steel of the scaffold. But she had lived at court too long to trust in dreams. Outside the Tower, the world was already erasing her. At Hampton Court and Whitehall, her portraits were taken down. Her cipher, the intertwined A and H that once gleamed from every tapestry, was being replaced with Jane Seymour's white phoenix. The court had received the order to treat Anne as never having been queen at all. Her marriage had been declared invalid, her child illegitimate. The law had rewritten her life while her body was still breathing. And yet she still stood, in slippers worn smooth by pacing, in a gown faded from too many tears, in silence so thick it seemed the air itself had turned to stone. The execution was rescheduled again, first set for the 18th. then moved to the 19th. Anne had been ready each time. She had risen early, dressed carefully, prayed as though her voice might rise higher than the tower's walls. And then, she had been told to wait. Each delay stretched her composure thinner. Like glass held over flame, the guards said little, the priest said less. Even her watchers, at last, looked away. And when night fell on the 18th day of May, Anne knew there would be no more postponements. The next sunrise would be her last. The final hours were spent in something like peace. She asked to receive the sacrament. She wrote down her thoughts. She arranged a small purse of coins to be distributed to the poor, not from her own wealth, which had been seized, but from what little was allowed her for dignity. When the priest came, she confessed in full, receiving absolution. She did not cry. Those who saw her said there was a lightness in her expression, the kind that comes not from hope, but from clarity. She knew now that there would be no more arguments, no more trials, no more betrayal, only stillness. She slept a little that night, or at least she closed her eyes. The tower's bells marked the passing hours like a heartbeat, and when dawn came, the women who had watched her for days now could no longer meet her eyes. There was one last note, folded and hidden beneath her pillow. No one knows what it said, or if it was ever found. Perhaps it was meant for Elizabeth. Perhaps it was simply a final thought, scribbled to remind herself that she had lived, not just as queen, but as woman, as mother, as mind. Anne Boleyn had once been the most powerful woman in England, and now, her legacy rested not in jewels, but in paper and memory. The sword waited. The scaffold stood. The king's court had already moved on, but in that letter, in those final moments, Anne had written herself back into history, not as the harlot they tried to paint, nor the seductress they feared, but as a voice that refused to be silenced. The morning came as softly as any other, the kind of morning that might have begun with bells for mass or the rustle of court ladies preparing for a garden walk. But on the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, the morning in the Tower of London bore no music, no laughter, no air of ordinary life. It carried with it only the faint light of sunrise sliding across cold stone, and the knowledge that a queen was to die before the hour struck 10. The scaffold had been raised on Tower Green, a short walk from the royal apartments, a place chosen not for mercy, but for control. It was a private execution. No mob, no sea of Londoners crying for blood. Only a selected few noblemen, officials, and servants of the crown would be permitted to witness the event, and the king himself would not be among them. Anne Boleyn rose at dawn. Her ladies dressed her in a gown of muted elegance, said to be gray or black, trimmed with ermine, the symbol of dignity even in disgrace. Over her shoulders she wore a crimson robe, the color of saints and martyrs, though no one in the room would have dared say the word aloud. Her dark hair had been wrapped and pinned beneath a simple coif, so that no strands would interrupt the blade. Her hands pale, elegant, trembling just slightly, were folded in front of her, not in surrender, but in resolve. There was no priest with her as she walked the short path to the scaffold. Only her women, who had stayed through every hour of grief, and who now struggled to keep their faces still. Witnesses would later say she moved as though floating, as though her feet did not touch the earth at all. Others said she looked like a ghost already, too composed, too calm, her voice sweet and strong. As she stepped onto the scaffold, she turned to the crowd and spoke, not of vengeance, not of innocence, but of submission. She did not beg for justice. She did not curse the king. She praised him, as all condemned must, calling him a gentle and sovereign Lord. She asked for prayers, for mercy upon her soul, for the protection of those who had shown her kindness, and with her words, she performed the last duty expected of her to die well. She knelt without hesitation. There was no block. For the executioner, the one specially summoned from Calais, used not an axe, but a sword, a long, gleaming French blade, swift and precise, selected by Henry himself for its elegance, for the cleanness of the cut, for the performance of mercy, cloaking the act of murder. She tucked her gown carefully beneath her knees. She folded her hands once more. The blindfold was tied gently, and she arranged it herself. Her lips moved in prayer, perhaps in Latin, perhaps in silence. And then she waited. The swordsman, a professional trained in the art of swift execution, had requested a small distraction. He called for his assistant to fetch his sword a trick. Anne turned her head slightly, instinctively, and in that moment, he struck. The blade cut cleanly. Her head fell into the straw. The silence lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for every heart on that scaffold to remember it for the rest of their lives. Her ladies rushed forward. There was no physician, no royal salute, no procession. Her body was placed in a makeshift casket, an arrow chest, some say, borrowed from the tower's storerooms, and her head laid beside her. Together, they were carried into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and lowered into the earth beneath the floor. No stone marked her name. No liturgy sang her soul to heaven. The woman who had once been queen, who had crowned herself with St. Edward's crown, who had held a king's heart and carried the hope of a dynasty in her womb, was buried like a stranger. And where was Henry? He was not at the tower. He had not watched from the window, nor lingered near the river to hear the cannon fire that signaled her death. He was already planning a wedding. That very day, he rode to Jane Seymour at Wolf Hall. He wore white. His mood was described as celebratory. The next queen was already rising before the last had cooled in the grave. There were no letters of mourning, no memorials, no private tears. He had loved Anne fiercely once, broken his kingdom to win her. But on the day of her death, he did not look back. Those close to him knew not to speak her name. Her crest was removed from palaces, her portraits painted over the facade. Her motto, "The most happy," now seemed a joke whispered in dangerous corners. Even Elizabeth, her daughter, was stripped of title and rank, moved to lesser lodgings, her household dismissed, her future suddenly as uncertain as the wind. But Anne had left something that could not be buried, her memory. It lingered in the minds of those who had heard her speak Latin beside Erasmus, who had watched her debate bishops, who had seen her command the court, not with shouting but with wit and style. She had dared to be more than beautiful. She had dared to be brilliant, and that not her flirtation, not her ambition, was her true crime in a world that had no place for queens who thought like kings. In the years that followed, Anne Boleyn became many things. To some, she was a whore who had bewitched a king. To others, a martyr of reform. To her daughter, she would become a myth, half legend, half mother remembered in a few quiet phrases, an old ring, a prayer murmured before bed. But to history, she became something rarer, a woman who died not because she was guilty, but because she stood too close to a throne that could not tolerate rivals, even ones it had once adored. Her death did not end the story. It only began a new one written in the silence of stone floors, in the echo of the tower's cold halls, in the folded hands of a queen who met the sword, not with pleading, but with grace. Henry VIII, for all his power, could not erase her. He could unmake her marriage. He could strip her titles. He could strike her name from the chronicles. But he could not silence the story of a woman who rose from the embers of ambition and died with her eyes open, her hands folded, and her name whispered through centuries. The tower grows quiet after death. The crowds leave. The blood dries. The gossip turns its face toward newer scandals. But the stones remain. They always do. And so does the silence, heavy, hollow, and ancient, somewhere beneath the flagstones of St. Peter ad Vincula, without monument or royal mourning, lies the body of Anne Boleyn, daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth, sister of George, mother of Elizabeth, and the woman a king once swore to love above all others. She had been crowned in gold, paraded through cheering streets, given a crown few queens had worn before, and she had died before her 30th summer ended. Her name scratched from the walls, her memory repainted by men who had never dared meet her eyes when she lived. But the tower, unlike men, does not forget, and neither do stories. They whispered her name even in Jane Seymour's chambers, though never above a hush. They whispered it in foreign courts, where queens wondered if their crowns sat too loosely. They whispered it in the pages of ambassadors' letters, laced with disbelief that such a fall could be orchestrated so completely and so quickly. And they whispered it in the mind of a small girl growing up in the countryside, removed from court, her rank diminished, her mother never spoken of aloud. That girl Elizabeth had her mother's dark eyes, her father's steel, and a memory she carried in her silence. They had tried to remove Anne from history, but history, like water, remembers even the lightest touch, and it reshapes itself around the things buried beneath it. Anne's death was not the end of her power. It was only the beginning of her legend. For centuries, she would be reborn again and again in ink, on stage, behind candlelit desks, where scholars traced the lines of trial records and ambassadorial dispatches. Some painted her a saint, others a schemer. She was called witch, whore, reformer, martyr, victim. Every generation saw her through its own mirror, reflecting not the woman who died in the tower, but the fears and desires of the world trying to explain her. But beneath all the myths, there remains the truth of a woman who was more than the roles they cast her in. Anne Boleyn had a mind as sharp as any man's, a will that did not bend to kings, and a vision of what it meant to be more than ornamental. She had been raised not to rule, but to serve, yet she became the sun around which a kingdom turned until the king grew cold. She gave him a daughter, and in doing so, unknowingly shaped England's future. That child, marked as illegitimate, disinherited, dismissed, would survive the storm of stepmothers and regents, of rebellions and plots, and rise against every odd to reign for 45 years. Elizabeth I would never name her mother in public with sentiment, but she wore Anne's ring. She surrounded herself with Anne's kin. She echoed Anne's strength in every decision she made to rule without a man, to build her court in her image, and to remain the virgin queen, not out of chastity, but out of control. Through Elizabeth, Anne lived, not just in blood, but in legacy. There's something poetic in that the daughter of a queen slain for failing to give a son would become the greatest monarch in her nation's memory. That the woman branded as unchaste and treasonous would mother the embodiment of national purity and political genius. Anne's enemies had hoped her memory would rot alongside her body in the crypt. Instead, her shadow grew with every decade. Long and inescapable, she became a question that history could never quite settle. How could so many powerful men have feared one woman so deeply, even now? The story lingers. Visitors to the Tower of London pause near the site of her execution. Guides speak her name in reverent tones. Some say her spirit walks near the chapel where she is buried, head tucked beneath one arm, silent and watching. Others say she appears near the Queen's lodgings on the anniversary of her death. But perhaps the ghost is not in the tower. Perhaps the ghost lives in us in the way we still argue about her. The way her story is never told the same way twice. The way her life reminds us that love can be political, that power never protects, and that women who step too far out of line are remembered not for their brilliance, but for their downfall. But you are still awake. Aren't you listening? Because somewhere inside, you already know this was not just Anne's story. This was the story of how kingdoms destroy their queens when their crowns grow too heavy. It is the story of how a woman can be desired until she speaks, loved until she disobeys, crowned until she commands. It is the story of what happens when love becomes a transaction and marriage a battlefield. It is the story of betrayal wrapped in ceremony, of justice twisted into theater, of silence, louder than any scream. And it is a story that will be told again, because it has never stopped happening. But perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll remember her not just as the queen who died, but as the queen who refused to disappear. You'll see her standing in the early light, her hands folded, her eyes steady. You'll hear her voice, and still calm, even as the sword was raised. And you'll know, as history knows, as time has proven, that they killed her body, but not her story, not her daughter, not her defiance. And maybe, just maybe, in the deepest part of you, you'll carry her forward, into the next morning, into the next telling, into the place where forgotten queens rise again, not in revenge, but in remembrance. Good night, and remember her name,